The reason this moment refuses to settle is simple. Too many statements depend on everything staying exactly as it was first presented, and that rarely happens in cases like this. When Candace Owens revisited the Fort Huachuca narrative, she did not introduce a brand new theory. She re-examined an existing one. She placed dates, movements, and public remarks back onto a single line and asked whether they truly aligned. What emerged was not a contradiction you could dismiss at a glance, but a pattern that felt managed. The more Owens spoke, the clearer it became that Fort Huachuca was not controversial because of what definitively happened there, but because of how quickly the conversation around it was shut down. Certain questions were labeled settled before they were fully aired. Certain explanations were repeated until repetition replaced verification. That alone would not normally trigger the level of reaction that followed, but then came the insistence that nothing new was worth examining. Owens pushed back on that idea. She argued that timelines do not become immune to review simply because they are uncomfortable. In her view, the insistence on finality came too early, and it came from too many directions at once. Media figures echoed one another. Online defenders used identical language. The emphasis was not on walking the public through evidence, but on restoring confidence as quickly as possible. This is where perspectives begin to split. To some, that coordination looked responsible, a way to prevent confusion. To others, it looked like containment. The Fort Huachuca alibi claims sit at the center of that divide. Owen suggested that the absence narrative relied on assumptions that were never independently confirmed. She questioned why metadata was introduced selectively and why its interpretation shifted depending on who referenced it. If the information was decisive, why not release it fully? If it was inconclusive, why present it as final? Those questions were never directly answered. Instead, the focus turned toward Owens herself. Her motives were questioned, her tone was criticized, her persistence was reframed as provocation, and yet the underlying discrepancies remained untouched. Many people watching this will have very different opinions on what should have happened next. At the same time, Charlie Kirk continued to speak publicly about the dangers of speculation. She emphasized the emotional toll of rumors. She framed the conversation as one that risked distorting reality. For many viewers, that perspective carried weight. For others, it did not address the specific claims being raised. And that distinction matters, because denying speculation is not the same as clarifying facts. Owens repeatedly returned to the same point. If Andrew Kolvet told her that Charlie Kirk had expressed concern about threats the night before his death, and if Charlie Kirk maintains that no such messages existed, then the discrepancy requires resolution. It cannot be waved away by labeling it harmful discourse. Some will agree with how this was handled, others won't. Kolvet himself became an unexpected focal point. As a spokesperson, his words carried institutional weight. Owen suggested that his account was not casual commentary, but information presented as credible at the time. If that account was incorrect, why was it shared? If it was accurate, why was it later disavowed? No detailed clarification followed. Instead, the public was left with parallel versions of the same night, one in which warnings were shared, another in which they were impossible, both delivered with confidence, both defended vigorously. This detail continues to raise questions to this day. Authorities, meanwhile, have remained publicly focused on Tyler Robinson as the suspect. Court appearances proceed, legal processes continue, official statements emphasize procedure and restraint, but public attention does not follow the same rules as investigations. It moves toward unresolved tension, and Fort Huachuca continues to generate it. Owens has framed this as a broader issue than any single individual. She has suggested that once a narrative gains institutional backing, correcting it becomes less about accuracy and more about preserving credibility. Adjustments are resisted because admitting uncertainty threatens the stability of the whole structure. If you value detailed reporting like this, supporting the channel helps us continue uncovering stories that matter. Viewers who stay with us often catch details others miss, especially when public certainty arrives faster than evidence. As the debate intensified, so did the language around it. Phrases like mind virus entered the conversation. Labels replaced explanations. The discussion hardened into camps, and with each exchange, the original questions about timing, presence, and communication drifted further into the background. What would you have done at this point? Would you publish everything and accept the fallout? Would you maintain silence and let attention fade? Would you double down and hope confidence wins out? Owens chose escalation, not in volume, but in specificity. She narrowed her focus. She repeated names. She cited conversations. She challenged anyone involved to identify exactly where she was wrong. That approach ensured the story could not simply dissolve. For ongoing coverage and updates as this unfolds, staying connected makes a difference. Following the channel ensures you don't miss the next development as new responses emerge and older statements are re-examined. Because what remains unresolved is not just whether a message existed or whether an alibi holds, it is whether the public was given a complete picture at the moment when understanding mattered most, whether questions were dismissed too quickly, whether reassurance replaced scrutiny. And as long as those questions remain unanswered, the Fort Huachuca discussion will continue to resurface, drawing in new voices, reopening old statements, and pressing against the boundaries of what was supposed to be settled, moving forward without resolution, without closure, without the final clarification that would allow this story to finally rest. What has complicated this further is the emergence of secondary confirmations that were never intended for public review. Not documents released formally, not sworn testimony, but offhand acknowledgments, partial remarks, and indirect confirmations that surfaced briefly before being walked back. Several media figures who initially echoed the absence narrative later adjusted their phrasing. The adjustments were subtle, a word removed, a timestamp softened, a statement reframed as assumption rather than fact. To a casual viewer, these changes meant nothing. To someone tracking the record closely, they meant everything. Because revisions without explanation create their own questions. One point that continues to draw attention is the timing of internal awareness. Owens has suggested that certain individuals appeared informed earlier than publicly acknowledged, not informed of an outcome, but informed of concern. The distinction matters. Concern implies anticipation. Anticipation implies context, and context implies prior signals that were either minimized or ignored. This is where perspectives begin to split. Some argue that hindsight creates false clarity. Others argue that warning signs only look obvious after someone admits they existed. The difficulty is that the record contains statements that suggest awareness without acknowledging significance. That ambiguity now sits at the center of the debate. Another layer involves how Fort Huachuca was referenced by different parties. In some accounts, it was definitive. In others, it was incidental. The same location described as decisive in one context became irrelevant in another. That inconsistency has never been formally reconciled. Many people watching this will have very different opinions on what should have happened next. Behind the scenes, sources close to the situation have described growing frustration, not with the investigation itself, but with how rigid the public narrative became. According to those accounts, there was pressure to maintain cohesion, to avoid reopening lines of inquiry that had already been publicly dismissed. That pressure did not originate from a single office. It appeared distributed, informal, reinforced through silence as much as through statements. Owens has framed this as an example of institutional self-protection rather than individual intent. Her argument rests on the idea that once a version of events becomes the official version, deviations are treated as threats, regardless of their merit. The goal shifts from understanding to containment. Some will agree with how this was handled, others won't. What remains unresolved is the role of intermediary figures, not decision-makers, not investigators, but communicators, people whose job it was to relay information accurately, yet whose accounts now appear to conflict. Owens has continued to emphasize that these conflicts did not arise from speculation, but from direct communication. That emphasis is significant. Because if the contradictions originate from within the same organizational ecosystem, dismissing them as external noise becomes difficult. The questions no longer come from outsiders, they come from inside the narrative itself. This detail continues to raise questions to this day. Public trust often depends on consistency. When consistency breaks, explanations matter. In this case, explanations have been sparse. Statements have been issued, but reconciliation has not. Each side insists clarity already exists, yet neither side has addressed the other's core claim, and so the gap remains. If you value detailed reporting like this, supporting the channel helps us continue uncovering stories that matter. Viewers who stay with us often catch details others miss, especially when attention shifts away from unresolved inconsistencies. As time passes, new voices have begun to weigh in. Analysts, former officials, commentators who were initially silent. Their contributions do not settle the issue, but they expand it. They point out how often high-profile cases rely on early narratives that later resist correction, even when circumstances change. What would you have done at this point? Would you reopen the record publicly? Would you rely on formal proceedings alone? Would you trust that time will soften the questions? Owens has indicated that time has done the opposite, that distance has allowed patterns to emerge that were not visible before. Patterns in language, patterns in response, patterns in what is emphasized and what is avoided. For ongoing coverage and updates as this unfolds, staying connected makes a difference. Following the channel ensures you don't miss the next development as additional information surfaces and existing statements are reevaluated. Because the story is no longer confined to a single night or a single location, it now encompasses how institutions respond under scrutiny, how narratives are stabilized, and how unresolved details persist beneath official certainty. And as more attention returns to Fort Huachuca, not as a footnote but as a focal point, the pressure to address what remains unclear continues to build, drawing the conversation forward, still open, still contested, still unfolding, with no resolution yet in sight.